You're listening to Getting It Wrong to Get It Right.
Urs, welcome to Getting It Wrong to Get It Right. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Joe. I'm looking forward to this.
You have a book, Humility and Leadership. Just looking at your profile here, you've been with NATO, you're an author, you have a great leadership philosophy as well. You do lots of speaking engagements. You're originally from Europe and you're living in the States. So I want to ask you first, what is humility and leadership?
So the way I define humble leadership or radical humility in leadership has three main tenets. The first one is really an accurate view of myself. So I see myself in line with how others see me. So that's deep self-awareness. And that's what people often think of when they think of humility, right? I don't see myself too high, too ambitious, but also not too low, but accurately. So a deep self-awareness. The second sort of leg of leading with humility is leading relationally. So moving away from leading simply by content expertise, and certainly not only by position, but by relationship. So building meaningful and trusting relationships with my people, both one-on-one and then on an organizational level. I'll talk about the work of Amy Edmondson in my book, Psychological Safety, Championing a Fearless Culture. And then the third tenet is really the famous growth mindset. So, you talk about a lot of about getting things wrong to get them right. So how do I shift my attitude, my thinking, my feelings from seeing mistakes and failures as something to be ashamed of or worse, sweep under the carpet to actually something I can learn from and grow and I can talk openly about? So those are the three tenets: self-awareness, lead relationally, and the growth mindset.
You mentioned something there about yourself and your teams. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that I have met really toxic leaders, and probably I was put in front of those people so I could be a better leader, because I want how they treated me or how they treated the other people around them made me realize that that's not the way I want to run a company. That's not the way I want to treat people. So when it comes to, humility, when it comes to, as you say, radical humility, what is the opposite to that? When people hear those words, what do they conjure up in their mind and then express to you?
As the opposite, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think, toxic, arrogance. So, we don't have to talk about politics, but a lot of the, current world leaders would sort of display those characteristics. And somebody who feels the need to constantly talk about what they know, how much they know, the famous know-it-alls who have an opinion about everything. It's actually interesting. Research shows that the more we learn, the more we grow, the more humble we actually become, because we are more aware of our limitations. This is why often, not always, true experts are way more humble, come across as way more humble than ignorant folks who seem to know it all. And so an opposite would be a know-it-all. I had during my national service in Switzerland, in my case, I almost got kicked out of officer school because I had one of those commanders. I had a colonel who was clearly an alcoholic. You could reek the alcohol from like 10 feet away. And he was preaching to us about, self-discipline and working hard. And I lost it on him. That was my bad. I laughed at him and I almost got kicked out. And so when you ask about what's the opposite, I immediately thought of that colonel, literally, what is it now, 38 years ago, that is still sticking in my mind. And much like you, I went like, I never want to be that person. So a negative sort of example.
You were in the military and you could have chosen multiple paths coming out of the military. You could have been a consultant within strategic military exercises. You could have got into security. There are multiple roads that you could have taken. Why leadership?
Well, Joe, I might have to sort of clarify one thing here. So Switzerland has a national service model, right? So every citizen
has
serves.
To join.
Exactly. And
yeah.
So every male. So I did. And so very few people actually become professional soldiers, right? We are all civilians in uniform. And so The military national service in my early and mid 20s was really, after frankly my soccer team as a teenager and the scouts as a child, was sort of my first leadership lab. And so, when else do you have responsibility for a platoon of 40 people at age 20? Right. And that's when I discovered during that national service that I really dig leadership. Like I love leadership. And while I didn't go into, as you mentioned, security, I went to academic path. I went to university and actually became a geographer. But I always knew that I love leadership. And so the national service sort of sparked that interest big time.
Yeah, and I think I can only relate to, I fell in love with listening to people and talking to people. I think I was about 17 and I got a summer job working as a bus conductor. So I was on the buses in Dublin, in good parts and in really rough parts of Dublin. So there was places where the police wouldn't go after 11 o'clock at night, but I would be on the last bus collecting money off people going into these areas. Okay,
Wow.
so I really sort of understood how people acted and seeing them in different walks of life. And one of the things that sparked my interest was communication. And I became really curious about how people function. And that's where it probably just was a natural progression through sales and business and wanting to be a good leader. And there's an old saying, if he walks like a guru, talks like a guru, and dresses like a guru, he's not a guru. And so for me, it's just being who I am. For yourself, when you are meeting companies and they bring you in to teach them really to be leaders, what's the one hurdle that you have to get them to overcome so they can break free on that path?
I'm answering the question in a second. I want to say one more thing about the leadership piece. You just mentioned your experience on the buses and that how that engagement, learning about people sort of steered you towards sales. One thing that really was very clear to me that I love people. And so I actually strongly believe in order to be a good leader, you have to fundamentally love people. It doesn't mean that you have to be an extrovert at all, but you fundamentally have to have an interest in other people, no matter which industry, your business you're in as a leader. So that's so your other question, I love people. And so that drove me to leadership. But so answering your question about the hurdle, I think the biggest hurdle, and I do a bunch of speaking in more blue collar industries, construction, roofers. The biggest hurdle is to help them see that leading with humility, leading with a bit of vulnerability, which is very close to my heart. We can talk about that if we may, about how that is one of the most powerful ways to build trust, is not being weak. It's not being soft. It's a legitimate and very powerful leadership tactic. So I think the biggest hurdle for people to embrace leading with humility is understanding that it's not being soft or cozy or just nice with each other. It's not that at all. It's about, this is by the title of my book is Be a Badass Leader Who Achieves Amazing Results and a Good Human, right? So this notion that we either have to be a tough leader or a kind person is really a false dichotomy. We can actually all hold our people to the highest standards while building meaningful and trusting relationships with them. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let somebody go. Let's be very clear about that. So anyway, that's sort of maybe the biggest hurdle that I need to help people overcome.
It's interesting you're saying that. I'm looking for some notes that I scribbled down there and I can't find them actually. Anyway, we'll find them. There is a difference between being a good leader and being a toxic asshole. And,
It's that big.
It's that big, yeah. And it's pulling the Band-Aid off. And it's interesting that you bring this up because I'm doing a talk this weekend and I'm doing a talk on masculinity and toxic masculinity. And the reason why I'm bringing this conversation up is because some young people are finding it very confusing because all they hear is toxic masculinity. Where for me, masculinity is honor, respect, accountability. It's about being ethical. It's about, having empathy. And these young people aren't aware of this. And I can only go back to when, as I was saying, when I was younger and I had a boss that was a complete a-hole. And then later on in life, I had one and caused me great anxiety. And I felt trapped because I didn't have the tools and I wasn't experienced enough to be able to deal with this bully. And you mentioned there, there's a difference about being nice. There's a difference about, there's the feels apart about the asshole and the real one. What's the line in the middle that someone can be tough, they have confidence and get people to follow them as well without crossing that line?
Yeah, I think what I come back to is the loving people and the building trusting relationships with my people. But actually, before I even go there, is my sense of self as a leader. So if we're talking about, I'm going to be very interested, by the way, how your talk goes this weekend. I think it's a very timely and super interesting topic right now. So if I'm a, toxic leader, then I'm arrogant and I bully people. Most likely, I hide my deep own insecurities with that bullying behavior. And so before I even talk about relationships, it's about the sense of self I have. I actually argue that in order to be a humble leader that achieves results, I need to be fundamentally confident in myself. Only, for example, if I am deeply confident, have a strong sense of self, know myself, am grounded, am I able to, for example, ask the hard questions like, Joe, I'm your manager. What feedback do you have? What can I do better? Where can I be a better manager for you? You will never hear a toxic leader ask those questions because they're deeply insecure deep down. And so to me, it comes back not to over-psychologize it, but to the sense of self I have as a leader. And then the second point I was mentioned earlier is this notion of loving people, of truly wanting to elevate them. And that means, a toxic leader doesn't really, as a general rule, take pride in other people's success. A humble leader does. And so that's another area I would point to.
Do you think that all comes with age?
If it comes with age?
Yeah, as we get older, we get wiser.
I sure hope so, Joe. That's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any research that actually looks over the lifespan. That would be very interesting. But what's my opinion on this? Let me think about this for a second. This is just anecdotal based on my own experience, but I definitely hear more people in the latter parts or the twilights of their career, taking great pride in the people they've hired, they've mentored, they've trained, and the success of those folks. And I often have people in their 50s, 60s, 70s talk about how that makes them proud and almost like that's their legacy. They talk about, yes, I'm doing a speech next week for a construction association, and they build amazing buildings, they build the city, like that's all cool, and we make lots of money. Most people, not everybody of course, most people take really great pride and see their legacy in the success of the people who they mentor. So I do think it somewhat comes with age.
The reason I asked that, because I went through I looked at my 50s and my 50s, and I look at those different development years. And anyone listening to this of a certain age will say, if I knew what I knew now, 10 years ago, I would be a different person. And in 10 years' time, they'll say, oh, if I knew what I knew now, my God, what I could have achieved 10 years ago. And I've noticed that while in my 50s, as we get closer to one end of the scale and the balance starts to tip, I really looked at guilt, shame, envy, being comforted in my own solitude, and looking at all these elements of my life actually helped me be more aware of who I am. And that's why I've asked the question, because I think as we get older, we, look at these. Like I asked someone in their 40s, I said to him, have you looked at your shame, your guilt? No, I wouldn't do that. And I said, wait till you're in your 50s and you'll have a look at that. And I'm waiting for them to be in their 50s when I'm in their 60s, and I'll ask them, I have to wait 10 years, But what I'm getting at is that the wisdom and the knowledge that we have learned, especially you and me came from a time where there was recessions. We came from a time where everyone had to travel. And the world is different now after, especially after COVID and everything. That old good old leadership, I think, is so important now than ever before. So my question to you, people that you're dealing with, do they need that, or are you taking them into a whole new different direction?
So by the way, John, what you just said is beautiful. Like that's amazing, right? And I do want to say that again, this is just my view, anecdotal evidence. That's not true for everybody. That's not true for everybody. Like we actually, you clearly are a lifelong learner. You want to grow. You want to get better, no matter how old you or we are. And that's a beautiful thing. And I humbly claim that I'm trying to do the same thing. And I certainly can look back over some aspects of my career where, I probably wasn't exactly an arrogant A, but, close to it, frankly, in my 20s. So certainly learning along and, the shame and guilt, like speaking about myself, I still deal with this around this need to be productive, this need to produce, this need to do versus sometimes just be. I have 2 teenage boys, and anybody who's listening or watching, who has kids knows how important that present in the moment time is with your kids at any age. And so it's something that I still have to work on to overcome that guilt that I'm only worth something is if I produce. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. Yeah. And now I forgot the question, Joe. I'm sorry. What was the question?
What direction are young people needing that support, and what direction are you taking them? Because you're influencing these people.
So I'm going to share a little anecdote and I'll answer your question. I literally just this morning received an email from a PhD student actually in Scotland who just published a peer-reviewed paper on humble leadership. And he emailed me and said that my book, which is not an academic book, inspired him to start his PhD thesis in humble leadership. Now, Joe, that is what gets me out of bed in the morning. Like, that is so amazing. It's one person, but one person a young person who decided to pursue their PhD work in the arena simply because, not simply, my book played, some sort of role in that. So that's huge. So, but to answer your question, we just talked about how with age comes wisdom, hopefully more humility. But I actually also have to say that when I work with younger folks, and often in my audiences and, the readers, I just mentioned this young guy, they obviously span from their 20s into their 70s and 80s, that there is actually a great reception among young folks for humble leadership, for how my approach works. And, this is sort of too stereotypical, but, top-down command control, really doesn't work with this generation anymore. We know that. They want purpose, they want meaning. Yes, they want money too. They want flexibility, like all the stuff. And they want to know, and they want relationships. There's research that shows that if people have a best friend at work, they're 7 times more engaged and less likely to quit. And so this notion of giving people purpose, building strong relationships, making them seen and heard is super resonating with the younger generation. And so, while obviously when we're younger, we might be ignorant in some arenas, I have actually super impressed and hopeful for, despite of everything that's going on for the future of our world when I look at those young people.
Yeah, but if you think about it, if you can look back at a boss that was excellent, you went in, I'm talking to the audience as well, you went in to work happy. You were looking forward to going in. You laughed. You had some fun. You did your work. You were on a buzz. You went home and you did a great job. It's different if you're going into a place where that culture isn't there. And it's a culture where someone can go in and dread going in, and they have to go in because they have to pay the bills. But it's torture for them, so much that someone might feel like ending their life because of it. So culture, and for you, leadership is all about culture as well. And you mentioned about the future. What do you feel is going to happen to leadership culture over the next decade?
So first of all, as leaders, we're the keepers and the champions of the culture. Let's be super clear. The buck stops with you. You own it, like everything. So you, Joe, on your team, I own it on my team. The good, the bad, the ugly, it all is up to me. And so you're absolutely right. I'm very passionate about this. And we have a huge, if you think of leadership and culture, it's sort of the 2 sides of the same coin, right? They influence each other in a big way. So here is So I have a couple of thoughts on this. Where does it go in the next 10 years? We know that a third of today's countries are run by elected autocrats. And so it's a whole separate conversation, but sort of as far as I'm concerned, that world is going in the wrong direction. And it doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. So very, command control and autocratic leadership. On the other hand, when I look at the future of business leadership, I see an increasing reception for a culture of psychological safety, the understanding that indeed a fearless culture is the key to winning. And so, of course, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future, Joe, right? But I actually think that there is this discrepancy we're experiencing right now, the political culture, the political leadership, and what's going on overall. Of course, there's always outliers in the business world. I'm convinced that in time, a humble, a fearless, a psychologically safe culture won't just be the exception, but the ante to play for any team and organization or business to thrive. So that's my thoughts on the future of culture.
Yeah, you mentioned there, about political twice, and for myself personally, I'm a political nomad, probably as someone described, a political atheist, because I've lost complete faith in what's going on. And there's different types of leaders. And I was on a show there, I had someone on probably last year, and we mentioned about there's different types of leadership. There's business leadership, there's political leadership. For political leadership, the person stands on a podium and talks about stuff and does whatever and then goes off. And I don't think if young people coming up, they should look at those political leaders as icons of I want to be like them. They should be looking at a different direction, different leaders in their community. There has been so many books written on leadership over the decades that we're still writing them and we'll never get it right. But leadership comes from community. Leadership comes from our ancestral DNA, where in small communities, you had the old wise person who shared the knowledge with everybody. That's where leadership came from. And then it sprung out all into different areas of culture and countries and whatever it may be. Culture, leadership, community. People should look at someone that they admire that isn't just on a podium talking whatever and then running off into the background. They should look for people that are humble like you.
Yeah. You bring up a really excellent point, which I agree 100% with. And you often find that people, even if they're on different ends of the spectrum politically, they actually can agree that in their day-to-day life, the people who run the community center, the book club, whatever, they can actually agree on those leadership traits. So, a lot of this is tied up in sort of our evolutionary histories. For 99% of our evolution, we had to rely on, strong, confident, charismatic, mainly men to sort of wise men to protect us from danger. And we're still sort of, and then character, to your point, and honesty and integrity was much easier to judge because we hung around the same 15, 20, 30 people, right? But now, to your point, right, we still sort of are drawn as a human species towards this strongman leadership attributes, but we have to judge people, based on what they're saying from a podium versus our personal interactions. And I love your challenge there, when we actually focus on the good leaders we experience in the interactions we have in our communities, that's where we have the true qualities shine versus, to your point, when it's just showmanship.
There's something just coming through to me at the moment about when you mentioned about your sons, and there's one thing that I learned, and I'm going a little bit off topic, one thing that someone said to me in an interview probably maybe about 4, 5, maybe 6 years ago, Clive. And what they said to me, which I put into practice, he said to me, if you lose it with your kids or have a row with your kids, be the man afterwards and go up to them and say to them, it's not you, it wasn't you, it was me, and I take the blame and full responsibility. And he said to me, by doing that, as your kids get older, they won't have that hang up because you admitted that to them. So kids' minds, and he said, when they get older and they're in a relationship or whatever they're doing, they'll be able to go, hey, look, I'm taking the blame here, not you. And that's humility. as well.
I love that, Joe. And I do talk briefly in my book about some parenting experiences. To be clear, parenting, most humbling experience of my life. Hardest job I ever loved. No question, hands down. Done a lot of cool stuff in my life. And I think what you're talking about is such an important point, and it applies to how we parent. It applies to how we lead our teams. It applies to how we interact with our community. It is taking responsibility for our stuff and modeling this for our kids. So look, I do plenty of things wrong as a dad, and I go off at my kids. But the one thing I do, which is exactly that, like I actually apologize. It doesn't make it, you can't undo it, but you can take responsibility. And I think you're right. It's all about, it comes back to much more powerful to model than to talk about stuff. The way I show up is much more powerful than if I have, lengthy conversations about what should and shouldn't be.
I did a talk last week on resilience, breaking the habit. And I spoke to the audience about reaction versus response. And I said, society has taught us to react, and sometimes we just react where we should take a breath and then respond. And there was a couple in the audience and they nudged each other. Afterwards they came off. She said, I'm the reactor, and he says, I'm the responder. And she goes, I'm going to use that little technique he gave me about just taking a little breath before I respond. And I said, look, for me, I'm a reactor, but I'm learning to be a responder. Yeah. And, things will push you in the house.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah. So,
I don't know who said that, but there is freedom in the pause, right? There is freedom in the pause between the stimulus and how I hopefully then respond and not react.
And that comes from meditation, where there's the pause in the breath is more important than the breathing in and out in meditation.
Yeah. Love that.
Do people know what it is? Do people, are they learning? Is it different today than what it was before COVID?
I think, so let me ask you this. How do you define it? When you ask, do people know what it is? So how do you see it?
I defined it in one way, being able to see what's in front of you and being able to manage it in a relaxed manner and make a decision that it then is acceptable and you move on with it.
So I think that, to me, it sort of hangs together with the growth mindset as well. I think people might think of it as more, okay, how do I deal with setbacks and failures, right? So, and do I come back stronger, more resilient? And I think, athletes are amazing, and I do have an ultra endurance background as well, are amazing examples of who can teach us resilience, where making a mistake or failing at something is simply part of the course in order to get better. And so they build resilience by taking risks, trying new things, failing, coming, second, third, fourth, fifth, but keeping at it. And I think the important piece there is that I'm embracing a learning mindset and that I'm able to move from often the sort of emotional overwhelm we feel when we fall down, when we have a setback, and then they can move through that emotional turmoil of shame, regret, guilt, to actually learning from the experience. So I always think of athletes as wonderful examples.
Well, an ultra athlete yourself in skiing, do you think that helps you with your resilience?
Oh, no question. 100%. I mean, I write about an experience in the book where I almost died during an ultra endurance race. I was racing across America nonstop for 3,000 miles and I ended up in ICU with pulmonary edema with an oxygen saturation of 44%. And so that was not pretty.
That's having a bad day.
A very bloody bad day in the office or on the bike or at ICU. So I used that and, I was preparing. This is a big race, more like a mountaineering expedition. You have a team, you have support vehicles, logistics, yada, yada. So it was a huge deal for me. I prepared for 2 years. And then instead of finishing the thing, I ended up in ICU, almost died. And so I had huge shame. I had regrets. I had guilt. Having dragged my crew along with all that stuff. Right? And so I had to really work hard on the reframing. And so that particular experience, which I chat about in the book, how do I go from I'm worthless, this was a waste of time and money, I've dragged all these people, I feel terribly guilty, to my DNF, my did not finish, will help me go faster next year. Sort of go from the emotional overwhelm to a reframe statement. And it did, because I went back and learned about what actually went wrong. And sure enough, next year I had actually my best ultra cycling season. So yes, it does help.
But not thinking that the way the mind works and the body, that we learn more from our mistakes than we do from our triumphs. Because, triumph, if it just happens, you run and you win and there's no effort. But if you do something and you lose, or you break, you twist your ankle, or you get injured or end up in hospital, those things are flooding your mind with, okay, what did I do wrong? How can I improve that? What is the thing that I need to do where? How can I not happen that again? All these things are firing up in your mind to be better. So the question, do the bad things or the lessons in life which we thought, were wrong, are they the ones that we kind of said, right, it's going to make us right the next time?
I think so. I think the saying, strength does not come from winning easy battles, but from losing hard-fought ones. I think there is truth to that. There's a couple of caveats to that. Absolutely, by necessity, we need to learn. We learn from our failures. By the way, we should also learn more from our wins, because we don't do that enough. When we're all overconfident, right? We have the overconfidence bias as a human. When we have a win, when we have a success, who's responsible? I am, because I'm so great. And, never mind all the external factors, sheer luck, that might play the role. So we actually should do after-action reviews after our successes and wins as well, and be more honest with ourselves. So having said that, I do believe that our setbacks and failures can teach us a tremendous amount. But we need to be able to really learn the lessons. There's plenty of people who don't learn from their setbacks for a variety of reasons, right? If you remain in this emotionally flooded state, then, people just become bitter and actually never learn. So it's not a given by any stretch that we learn from our failures, but I do agree with you. It's certainly the more foundational lessons than the successes.
What could you change in your life?
What could I change in my life?
What would you change if you could?
What would I change? So the first flip answer that comes to mind is, I would like my body to be able to do all the crazy stuff I was able to do. And that's but what's more important is what I talked earlier. I wish I could break through this feeling of having to be constantly productive and produce to be worth something. So I'm still working on this. This is what I mentioned earlier. I'm way better than I was earlier. But that, if I could just switch that off and be more content with what I have versus always striving for the next thing, that would be a wonderful thing to help me have more peace of mind.
But do you think that's a competitive edge that's within you?
Look, Joe, every weakness is a strength overdone. I have a strength, right? I have a drive. I get stuff done, and absolutely, it's it gives me some advantage, but I can overdo it, and then it becomes counterproductive.
You mentioned, being content. I lived part of my life where I was content, and then I looked at my life, and everything is, believe me, wonderful, and I was content. And when I looked at it, I realized, this is for me, that being content no longer served me. And I had to move out of being content into a next phase of my life. And that next phase was, okay, I'm going to go and do something in the business that I've never achieved before. Now, I've had great success in big business and earned, turnover of millions. And this was for me going, you know what? I've been content for a couple of years. Now I am moving forward in that. And what I had to do was look at who I am. So I looked at and wrote a letter to my future self, what I am or achieved in 3-4 years. And then on the other side of the page, I wrote, what happens if I do nothing? And then I made micro commitments and I was disciplined to doing that. But before I could do that, I had to look at my values. So I think for yourself is you had a purpose and now you have a new purpose, and that new purpose may be just to be able not to be so hard on yourself.
Well, thank you for sharing, Joe. That makes perfect sense, right? And this is, this is why life and leadership is a thinking person's sport. What might be right for me today might not be right for me in 3 years. And what's right for me is certainly not right for you. So I love what you shared. Absolutely. I too had times, where I was more content, and maybe I was sometimes maybe a bit intellectually lazy, frankly, in the past. And so I need to push myself out of that. But yeah, I love what you're saying. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and it's about all the knowledge that we get. And here's about leadership as well. We can give everyone the leadership. Here's the knowledge, and they go, great. If they don't implement it, they're going to stay put of where they are in their careers or in their lives. But if they do implement it, the potentiality from them to grow, business growth, life growth, everything, is absolutely massive. So how do you get people to implement your teachings?
So start small. I often, when I speak, I make a real, or not just an effort, I give people like concrete takeaways. And sometimes I'm almost self-conscious because they, almost come across as a bit simplistic. But in order for people to start making changes, you talked about micro commitments before, Joe, right? Micro. Let's emphasize that. So let's start small. So a couple of things that I talk about that people can take away is in terms of becoming a more humble leader. A simple thing, which is very hard to do, but it's very simple. Ask your teammates for regular feedback on how you do as a leader. Hopefully you do your one-on-ones with your employees. At the end of every one-on-one, get into the habit of asking, hey, Joe, as every week, give me some feedback. What do you see me do well? And what do you see me as needing to improve? And by the way, leadership is not a popularity contest, but we always ask, we always listen, but you get to decide what you're acting on. So regularly checking in for feedback, because frankly, we are all overconfident. We all think we're better than we actually are. And so that's the first piece. The second, small thing that, you sort of touched on that, depending on the comfort level of the audience, with mindfulness, with journaling. So building my self-awareness by establishing some sort of routine that helps me reflect on my leadership. I journal every morning. Sometimes it's literally for 3 minutes. What did I do well in the last 24 hours? Actually, I start with I'm grateful for. There's plenty of research showing that a gratitude journal actually makes you happier. What did I do well the last 24 hours? What do I want to do better? And what's the one and most important thing for today? So people do different things. People ask themselves, what do I do well in my leadership and what do I want to improve in my leadership? But some sort of, it could be mindfulness, it could be talking to a coach or a counselor, whatever, some sort of way to a small practice to build my self-awareness. So these are the two things that I would advise people to do.
It's interesting because I'm journaling and I get up and I don't know what to write about. So you've just given me an idea to start off my first question when I'm journaling every morning. There's one thing that you mentioned there about going to your colleagues as a leader and asking them. For me, it was being able to take criticism. There was a time when I would be critiqued and I would take it and accept it. But inside, there was a part of me that would go, annoyed, and I don't want to be in this room anymore. I'm leaving. And it was being able to stand there in my own two shoes and acknowledge it and then use that to grow. And that's where I think some people can take criticism, that they have to kind of go, that. And now I've got to the stage, if someone doesn't criticize me, like, we'll have the team there and our engineer, I'd say to them, critique me, tell me about it. Oh, no, everything's fine. I need people to say, do this better, because I'm always wanted to learn. So I love being criticized, which is probably the complete opposite.
But you're right. Most people don't enjoy feedback because exactly what you're describing. And I want to normalize that. For most of us, when somebody gives us hard feedback, even if we're composed outwardly and say all the right things, thank you for the feedback, internally there's turmoil for a lot of us. And that's totally normal, right? And so obviously you've been now in a place where you can manage and handle that really constructively, right? And not just storm out.
And my wife says I'm horizontal. I have a couple of questions here for you that our producer wanted me to ask you. What do you do when it comes to investing in yourself?
So, while a bunch of different things come to mind right now, I'm committing professionally on reading a book every 10 days. So that's just building my, investing in my professional future. I also am professionally part of a speaker mastermind group. I work with a coach, so that's what I do. Professionally, that comes to mind immediately. Personally, I invest in myself by giving myself regular time out in the mountains, now in winter and spring, preferably on skis. I'll be doing this actually tomorrow and then Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Being out there, which is just what makes me so happy and so content, to use the word we used.
Next question. Can you share a pivotal moment where you learned a powerful lesson by getting it wrong to get it right?
So I am somebody who needed to learn when to shut up, because I always felt the need to share what I really felt. And I learned that, and that's, again, every weakness is a strength overdone. Sharing the elephant in the room, what's going on, is often valuable, but I need to learn how to shut up. And I learned this by getting fired from a job. I took a brief hiatus from my executive coaching practice, and I was hired by a client to be in-house. I was the director of marketing for investment management firm. The financial crisis, 07-08, our revenue evaporated in front of our eyes. One layoff after the other, cost-cutting rounds. And so we had the next round of layoffs come, and the 3 C-level executives invited me to their office to talk about where can we cut. And I knew nothing better but to say, well, for a company of our size, we don't really need 3 C-level executives. It did not prove to be a career-enhancing move. So the next day I was let go. So the lesson I learned there is I got it wrong by, speaking the truth in inverted commas, but I didn't read the room right. And now, even going back into the military at age 50 as a peacekeeper, I was so conscious about I can come across as, the old guy who knows everything better anyway. Like, I'll zip it. I'll do everything they ask me, yes, sir, and whatnot. Like, I'm going to work so hard to not be that person who always feels to have the last word.
Last word. What would you like to be remembered for?
That's going to sound cheesy, but I actually feel that it's the title of my book. He was a real badass and also such a good human. He was such a nice guy, kind guy.
And very last question. For our next guest, what message would you like to leave to them for them to be a badass?
For the next guest,
what words of wisdom would you like to share with them?
You can be both a good human, a human-centered, humble leader, and achieve badass results. It's not an either or. You can do both.
Beautiful. If someone wants to pick up your book.
Absolutely. So my book is sold wherever books are sold, on Amazon and in the States in bookstores. Well, actually, there's some bookstores internationally as well. You can find me on the web at urskoenig.com, and then the social platform I'm most active on and I really actually like is LinkedIn. So I'd love to hear from people what resonates, what doesn't.
Perfect. And we'll put a link in bio as well where people can click on your website as well. Urs, thank you for coming on to Getting It Wrong to Get It Right.
Joe, I loved it. Thanks so much.
Getting it wrong to get it right.